Kia ora koutou. Welcome to our Ask Me Anything on the cannabis referendum. And I'm here with Wellington Central candidate and long-time legalization campaigner, Abe Gray. Kia ora, Abe.
Kia ora.
Now, Abe, you were in Dunedin in 2017. You tried to, you started a cannabis museum in Christchurch last year. What's the deal, man? Why are you living all over the country?
Well, my family circumstance has actually caused me to move. My wife, for her career, has to work at different hospitals around New Zealand.
Right.
So yeah, it's kind of inconvenient when you're raising a family, but it's good for cannabis campaigning. And what I've known, but what has proven to be true in the course of that is every settlement in New Zealand of any size has a cannabis community that is already existing there. And yeah, some are, they're just waiting to sort of be networked, and some of them already are highly networked. And so everywhere I've gone, Wellington included, there's been an impetus for some sort of community space for cannabis enthusiasts, or at least events.
Yeah.
And yeah, we had the Cannabis Museum in Dunedin for 7 years, and then we moved to Christchurch last year. And the plan was to move to Wellington this year, and hopefully that can still be realized. But this year's been a bit of a write-off for everybody, I guess. Yeah.
And you've been campaigning for how long for legalization?
Well, I guess I was radicalized politically around cannabis legalization 21 years ago.
21 years ago.
Yeah.
Were you in New Zealand then, or were you?
No, that was back in Minnesota. And yeah, it was just, I guess I was your typical stoner teenager, not really very engaged or active, not interested in engaging in civics or really education, or just kind of like getting stoned and getting better quality cannabis for cheaper. And so my questions about why we were persecuted by the police, why it was so expensive, why the black market was our only option, that led me to sort of researching the history of prohibition, basically, and learning about that ever since the genesis of prohibition, it was always very contrived and not based on evidence, more based on racism and hysteria. And learning that such a major political paradigm, of a century could be sort of based on such tenuous lies and deliberately perpetuated to serve certain interests, that just kind of shocked me, and it was a light bulb moment, I guess, about politics for me. Yeah.
So this session, we're going to be alternating between Abe and I debunking some of the claims on the Say Nope to Dope website, which will be a bit of fun. And we're going to take your questions as well. So you can start asking your questions in whatever stream you're asking, and we'll try to pick those up. When you talk about the light bulb moment, Abe, was there one thing in particular that really shocked you, one fact or one piece of history that really stood out, or was it just the whole picture?
Well, just, I guess, the narrative, like going back to the blow by blow historical narrative of the 1930s, when it was first dreamed up to, a PR campaign of cannabis harm was first kind of rolled out, and looking at the footnotes to that and seeing that, it was always, it makes sense if it's kind of laid out to you, but if it's not put in context, it's easy to if it's not put in context, you can kind of be fooled by the drug war. But when you think about it, that era of the 1920s and 1930s was as well established historically as what we know as the era of yellow journalism, because the oligarchs, the newspaper magnates were totally monopolized, and they would just create stories to serve their own economic interests. We just learned that in history. Now that's not contested. It's not a conspiracy theory. And so the idea that, some sort of false narrative based on racism to demonize cannabis could have been doctored up in that era is not really that surprising.
No, but, and so it was the cotton people. That's the story that I heard. Is that?
Well, it's actually sort of like a whole group of interests. The newspapers themselves were very invested in pulping old growth forest, and had purchased vast tracts of the Pacific Northwest and swindled the indigenous people out of it and such. And so their kind of process was already heavily capitalized on wood paper pulp. And as technology developed, more advanced products could be made from hemp. Hemp was always one of the major industrial commodities dating back 12,000 years. It was one of the very first plants ever cultivated by humans, and the first source of rope, and all sorts of other human technologies that are very important. But once we got into the Industrial Revolution, 1920s, 1930s, then we could really take it apart quicker and make more things out of it. And that was a competitive sort of risk to, as you say, cotton, newsprint, pharmaceuticals, the seed as an oil. One of Henry Ford's first car ran on biodiesel, famously made from hemp paneling, hemp plastics.
Wow.
So all of that was being developed. And oil, at that time, it wasn't as ubiquitous as it was today. Like, oil took a sort of marketing effort in those early days to say, what would we use this for? Why would we use it? This is something new.
There's black stuff coming out of the ground. What are we going to do with it?
Yeah. And sort of in that process, saying things that we would traditionally use hemp products or byproducts for, there are various campaigns kind of say it was inferior or demonize that.
Right. You should have a live stream with Adriana. She is one of our Auckland candidates, and she is massive into industrial hemp uses. So that would be quite a fascinating conversation.
But back to your original question with the light bulb, I mean, the just that idea that it was like, wait a minute, it's like as an unquestioning sort of teenager, it was always like, oh yeah, cannabis is harmful, but I like it, so who cares, whatever. But then when it was like, oh, wait a minute, it's not actually harmful, it was kind of developed as a excuse to perpetuate police powers, essentially, that had existed for alcohol prohibition. And then they were going to be taken away because alcohol prohibition was unsustainable.
Right.
And so that what became the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs was all these cops with nothing to do after alcohol prohibition.
Right.
And, racism was rife. Slavery had ended, but Jim Crow was still rampant. Any attempt for African Americans to climb the social ladder was viewed with, extreme avarice, and especially in the jazz culture. And so, like jazz clubs, speakeasies under Prohibition, and then legal jazz clubs after Prohibition was repealed, really represented a threat to the traditional social hierarchy, because here you had, African Americans that were the most famous people in America at the time, sort of mingling with, white society, essentially. And that wasn't supposed to be happening. And so a lot of these figures were demonized, and cannabis was famous in the jazz culture. So it was really a perfect storm of these cultural conditions at the time. And to maintain the status quo and impose social control, a racist drug panic, which has been used over and over again.
Yeah, it sounds familiar, right? That's a pretty familiar, and the use of stop and search powers around. I mean that, cannabis is still what is now in New Zealand is supposedly non. It's effectively decriminalized, but that sort of stop and search power is still used and can lead to
Totally.
people going in for other
Totally.
offenses, right?
Yeah,
So-
and to the police's credit, they've toned it down quite a bit because of public pressure and media pressure, and the public won't accept as harsh treatment of cannabis users as they would in the past. But as you say, they still have that sort of thing hanging over, and they like to hold on to that. And so for me as a young person, reading about really just trying to figure out, why it was so hard for me to get cannabis, then kind of realized, oh, all these people put this structure in place that we're still justifying to this day.
Yeah.
And as the decades have gone by, we've had these sort of contrived justifications continually rolled out. And, the people that put this infrastructure in place and were benefiting from it economically 100 years ago, those structures still exist. They're still benefiting from it.
Yeah.
They're still advising our government. They're still justifying it. And it was
Speaking of contrived justifications, let's take the first one from the Say Nope to Dope campaign. And I want to use that. We've got this cool echo thing on this microphone. So I'm going to read these out with the echo thing on. Okay. So number one, potency. Today's marijuana is a different, harder drug. So, I mean, that's true though, isn't it? Today's marijuana is a different, harder drug, but unfortunately, this is kind of an own goal because it's been the illegal market that's seen this, right? It's seen the it become more powerful.
Yeah, and I mean, it's not a different, harder drug. Like varieties of cannabis that have had, the thing about cannabis is that it has so many different varieties and they vary in potency. And, for simplicity's sake, let's just say potency is the level of THC, but, there's hundreds of cannabinoids, hundreds of terpenes, and we're only just starting to scratch the surface with the potential effects of cannabis. But what Say Nope to Dope is talking about is THC. There have always been high THC varieties. It's just that, people have sought them out more efficiently. And yeah, I guess the ones that people have liked the most, they've crossed together, but that was happening in, ancient times, always in India and Pakistan, Nepal. They've had very potent cannabis. It's not, the hippies in the 1960s going on those Himalayan trails. They were getting just as stoned as we can get today.
But okay, so, but the, and I'm just going to hark back to my teenage years here. I mean, it does seem more powerful today.
Well, maybe in New Zealand.
In New Zealand.
There's better shit now, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, back in my day in teenage years, it was grown in the bush out in the Waitakares. I remember going for walks in the Waitakares, and we would go off track every now and again if we thought there might be a good clearing that someone might be using. But
you weren't putting them there. You were hoping someone else had already done the work. Geoff,
But now, of course, I think mostly it's done indoors, isn't it? And I mean, does that affect the strength?
Not really. No, I mean, it has more to do with the variety that's being grown. Okay. And obviously, if it's outside, it could get rained on or damaged by insects or pests or whatever. But no, New Zealand is great because we do have such a great climate, and there's so many different regional microclimates. And I mean, you see outdoor here that rivals some of the finest indoor. And the thing I love about New Zealand, and this has really come up again and again as I've operated the museum over the last 7 years, is every region of New Zealand considers itself to be the premier cannabis region of New Zealand. And if you think about it,
that rugby rivalry, yes.
Yeah, if you think about it, like, we've got Northland, we've got the Bay of Plenty, we've got the East Coast, we've got Taranaki, the Wairarapa, Golden Bay, west coast of the South Island. You start listing them off, and then there's not really any regions that you haven't listed anymore that are kind of, prime cannabis regions. Well, it's just the whole country, really.
Yeah. But okay, I mean, you've experienced legal markets overseas, and my understanding is overseas, in these legal markets, I mean, you can walk into stores and you can choose the kind of cannabis that you want. Much the way that we, when you're buying off the black market here, you have no idea of potency, but when you are buying, in these legal markets, you can actually see on the label what kind of potency, what kind of balance of THC and CBD.
Yeah, and that's the key, is responsible use. I mean, I guess what Say No to Dope is saying is, like, they're still, assuming that children are going to be getting blasted on this, and we'll probably have to debunk this further down. But these are age controlled. Only people over 20 are going to be able to purchase them, and it's going to be in a computer of who purchased what SKU, and all the. If it goes into the hands of the wrong person, there's going to be a chain of accountability.
Yeah.
So we're not worried about that. But if it has a label where you can see how potent it is, then you're going to select, like, if you want a stronger product, then that's what you'll get. Well, actually, under this legislation, you won't, because it'll be capped. But it's just about responsible use. I mean, the more potent the product, the less you have to use. That's the one thing the problem I have with people ragging on about the high THC. It's like, if I can, consume 1, microgram of substance and have the effect that I want, as opposed to smoking, half a gram or a whole gram of plant material with not much active ingredient in it. Why is that somehow better? Because it harks back to the old days? I don't know. I mean,
and you can't overdose on marijuana. I mean,
no, you're not going to die. I mean, sure, people abuse the concentrates that I'm alluding to, that you can use a smaller amount and get the same effective dose. People will abuse them, but that's the same with anything. With spirits, we regulate it. We try to keep track of the harmful users. It's a small percentage,
and ultimately, alcohol's
given health messages.
Alcohol's causes 3 times as much.
Yeah, you're not going to die. With spirits, you will die. Yeah.
With spirits, you'll die. With weed, you'll fall asleep and potentially eat some bad food. Right. Okay. So let's take a couple of questions. Oh, there's a couple of good questions here for you, Abe. When are you going to get back on Hodaki?
You'll have to address that to them. Actually, let's start a hashtag
petition,
campaign or something. Yeah.
Bring back Abe. Hashtag bring back Abe. Okay. Yeah. And have you got a startup ready to go when legalization comes through?
Well, we already have a venue with cannabis consumption club on premises and retail and stuff like that. Actually, at the moment we don't, but we'll be opening that back up as soon as there's some clear business confidence, I guess, or clear signals for business confidence. But
so the Whakamana Museum will continue somewhere.
Yeah, definitely, as soon as possible. And when legalization comes through, I would hope that it will be, a first mover, one of the hubs. We're already there, walking the walk. We would hope that, business doesn't always work that way, but fingers crossed, it's going to turn into the main consumption venue and or dispensary and or events venue.
Nice. Okay, back to Say Nope to Dope. We've been lied. Oh, hang on. Echo. We've been lied to before. This is not your parents' pot. Remember big tobacco. Tobacco companies lied to New Zealanders in the world for more than a century. Yes. This is all about big marijuana, who will deny evidence-based science and emphasize the economic benefits of large tax revenues while ignoring the harms. But people should always come before profits. So this is the irony of the Say Nope to Dope campaign, which is the least evidence-based campaign I've ever seen, saying that if we legalize marijuana, then the tobacco companies will start to warp the truth and go against the evidence.
Yeah, and I guess the funny thing is, Say Nope to Dope and the Drug Foundation agree on this point. They don't want big foreign corporations coming in, and public health experts don't trust foreign companies, selling a product because they have this 80-20 rule where only a small percentage is what they get their most volume out of, and they have to target them and kind of get them to consume more and more of it. This law was written by those public health experts, and they were really the only ones that got consulted, not really people in industry, not heavy consumers. I was never asked how I would like it to be, but what public health best practice shows is, it's probably true. Altruistic companies can start out, but the way capitalism works, you got to have growth and profits and stuff. And so when you're selling something like that, it is potentially inevitable, but they wrote this law to specifically exclude big business. And there's a cap on production. No one company can produce more than 20% of the allowable crop in any year. The licenses have to preferentially go to organizations that can show they provide a community benefit. And there's the way the licensing is written in this law, no large foreign corporation is ever going to want to be involved in the New Zealand cannabis market. And to be honest, even if this law was totally unrestricted commerce, they still probably wouldn't, because New Zealand is such a small market for them that we don't really, New Zealand doesn't have big foreign corporations as much as overseas, the warehouse instead of some overseas thing. We have Trade Me. Like, these companies don't come into New Zealand because we're not big enough to make the money, and then we have a indigenous solution, or usually just a clone of what's overseas, and it becomes really successful here. So that's what the New Zealand cannabis companies would be like. And the funny thing, the kind of I guess mixed messages of this bill and kind of the schizophrenia in it is, we want to get an economic opportunity, and we want there to be New Zealand companies creating jobs, and we want there to be commerce. But then we say, but we want to make sure that, the industry is sort of curtailed. But, if the regulatory settings are correct, you can still have industry and not have the harm. So I think that's a little bit of a missed opportunity. And
I think actually NZIER, from my read of their report that they put out, suggested that actually the legislation that has been put forward, if anything, is probably a little bit too harsh. And the risks are that then if it is too harsh, if the legislation is too harsh, then there's a risk that the black market might keep going, and there's a risk that you lose out on some economic opportunities, and some tax opportunities.
And the thing that I find a little bit offensive, actually, quite frankly, is these jurisdictions that are held up as a horror story of the worst untrammeled commerce, and this is what we don't want, is Colorado. But if you look at Colorado, it's actually like a thriving economy. It's doing so much better than the other states around it. Young people have prospects in careers. It's just driving so much economic activity, and the harm isn't there. The sky isn't falling in. You can see no difference other than extra hospitals and schools and fancy new public transport everywhere.
Yeah, because the money's gone back into schools and hospitals, right?
That's
right.
In
fact, they had so much money they didn't know what to do with it.
Exactly. They had to give it back. They're building out public transport everywhere. So it's really the quality of life in Colorado is sucking residents from all over the country to it. And no one would say, oh, what a hellhole Colorado is, except for people in New Zealand, not only the Nope to Dope campaigns, but even the people like the Drug Foundation, And so Colorado is great. The person who is has the largest share of the cannabis market in Colorado is a former Waikato dairy farmer. So
Really? Right. Okay. Okay, another question. Why should you vote? Yeah, this is from Tim. Why should you vote yes if you hate cannabis? So, any thoughts on how? Because at the moment, I mean, Tim's point, I guess, is that the debate is framed: if you like cannabis, vote yes. If you don't like cannabis, vote no.
Yeah,
But
that's
actually,
not
if you
correct.
don't like cannabis, you should probably vote yes too.
Yeah, actually, yeah. I mean, if you like cannabis, just hold your nose and vote because it's too restrictive, and we'll try to soften it up in the select committee process. And if you don't like cannabis, then definitely vote yes, because this is so restrictive. Someone like me, I'm going to be prevented from my worst cannabis excesses by this bill. So, which
Yeah.
no, I'm not.
And all of the evidence, from the kind of model that this bill is putting forward suggests there'll be reduced underage use, of course, much less, gang involvement in the cannabis market, all the benefits of that sort of stuff. We know that a lot of people go to buy green and come back with white. So
That's right. Well, and I've been really heartened to see. I've been around the country talking to people about cannabis all the time, and still recently as well. And I've spoken to quite a few people who do not like cannabis, who are, like, it's been used as such a culture war wedge issue in New Zealand. Like, we don't have a lot of wedge issues or culture war issues that can be used effectively. We're not like America, guns and race and homosexuality don't divide us very much, but
yeah,
cannabis has. And because of that, it's been used more often,
Yeah.
because we don't have a diverse array of things to use for that. And so
yeah.
this beat up on cannabis has been perpetual for the last 20, 30 years in New Zealand.
And it is a race thing here too, isn't it? Like you were saying about America. I mean, there's a lot of race.
That race is wrapped up in it, but it also sort of scoops in a lot of, cannabis use is totally across the board. It's not, I guess the stereotypes of it lead to that prejudice being race-based, but it actually draws in a whole bunch of people of all different cultures that end up bearing the brunt of that stereotype. And I guess cannabis policy over the last 30 years, that the way that it's been used over and over again as that beat up has led to a whole sector of New Zealand society that really views anyone who's a cannabis user as sort of subhuman, essentially. And what I think has come across really well in this legislation and the campaigning from the public health people is that, even if cannabis use made you subhuman, it would be better for society if that was controlled and, had a sort of ring fence drawn around it. And so I've spoken to a lot of people who say, I don't like cannabis, I don't like people that use it, but I am going to vote yes because it should be controlled. And I do want it out of the hands of youth. And I do want, the potency to be labeled and controlled and the production to be licensed. And I think that's the really thing that gives me hope, because we've seen a lot of media about yo-yoing with the polls, in the lead up so far over the last year and a half. And those polls, if you look at them, first of all, the yo-yoing is because they're asking different questions. And so it's not the same question being, asked over and over again and kind of shifting around. Secondly, that even-ish split is with the people who are decided. And then there's usually 15 to 20% undecided. And so if you compare any of those polls meaningfully, really the hard no's have remained at about 30%, which coincidentally is that same hard vote for national, no matter how much they embarrass themselves, constituency. Not saying there's complete overlap there, but so with the undecideds, once you include the undecideds, then that changes the numbers. Now, if they were going to be split evenly, it wouldn't change the numbers, but those undecideds are actually almost all firming up to yes, because they wanted to see the evidence. They wanted to think critically. And we always were confident as cannabis campaigners, because we knew that if there was a proper scientific evidence-backed debate that we would win.
Yeah.
That's why I came to top in 2017,
and
because
let's hope that continues in the run up to the election for sure.
Yeah, so with the Prime Minister's chief science advisor stuff coming out and the stuff from the Dunedin study and the Christchurch study, they're all saying, oh, no, we don't like cannabis and cannabis use is harmful, but criminal prohibition of cannabis is much, much more harmful and creates so many second and third order effects that it's basically not worth it. And so we're not telling you how to vote, but the reason why the reason why we would propose to control cannabis in this way is because it would work.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Okay, back to say nope to dope. Cannabis will be more than just smoking a joint. And there's pictures of coffees and chocolate, and
looks pretty civilized.
That looks great.
There's a syringe there, though.
A syringe?
Yeah. And actually, I don't know. I haven't looked at this website recently, but in the original Say Nope to Dope propaganda, they did claim that people would be taking cannabis concentrates and dropping them into their eye to get like super wasted. And I have to just say, as a disclaimer to anyone watching this, do not try that. It's very painful. It doesn't get you high. Causes infection in your eye. It's not a route of administration. So I don't know where they got that from.
Yeah.
Or the syringe in this image.
Yeah, bizarre. I mean, but absolutely, cannabis will be more than smoking a joint. And actually, that's fantastic because most of the harm from cannabis comes from smoking, combustion. So fantastic. Thanks, Say Nope to Dope, for pointing out one of the benefits. Of course, what they're pushing at here, though, is the gummy bear line, right? So that it can be, cannabis can be delivered by any means, and some of that might look like lollies. But I think anything
that looks like lollies is specifically excluded from this bill.
In the bill, that's right. So that's
and anything that looks like lollies is specifically excluded in Colorado. When they first started, you could make gummy bears because that was a common thing on the black market, but they sort of quickly realized, oh, this is like a candy for kids, probably shouldn't do that. Then they had to put labels on them, and then every piece had to have like a edible ink spray on warning. And then they're like, you can't do anything that looks like a candy for kids. And so now there's like a 20-page manual of different acceptable polyhedrons and color Pantones, so their regulation actually worked, their ability to adjust and integrate evidence. Colorado is a good example.
So really another one that's irrelevant there from Say Nope to Dope, or actually they're giving us good reasons to support legalization, because damn, I want that cup of coffee. Daniel, question from Daniel: do you think there are any valid arguments against legalization? That's a good question. It's a good, fair question. I don't know if I can think of any off the top of my head, but
well, it just depends if the only argument against legalization would be an argument for, say, anarchy, I guess, or, it depends on what your political philosophy is. If you believe in the state, then, and you believe in other sort of commonly used commodities being regulated, then there's no reason why cannabis should be treated differently. But if you don't believe in that, then of course, you might believe that you should be free to make whatever decisions you want.
Yeah. Okay. Right. So you think that's kind of the argument that some of the this. Yeah.
I guess what I'm getting at is the people who don't like legalization, who are pro cannabis but don't like legalization, don't like the government doing anything.
You're right. Yeah. Okay, cool. Yeah.
So it's like, okay, I used to have some sympathy to that when I was a teenager, but then I guess I had so many benefits from being a taxpayer and receiving sort of tax services from the government that I thought, hey, this is pretty good.
The comment, this is more of a comment, I think, from Warwick. The referendum result won't change anything, only the process in the parliamentary subcommittee. And this is an interesting point to bring in. Is there anything that that you would want to change in the parliamentary subcommittee in terms of how the if in terms of what you'd change about the legislation as it currently stands?
Well, I think a potency cap is unworkable. I think that it shouldn't be so hostile to industry, but that doesn't necessarily require the bill to change per se, because a lot of the actual details of the production cap and how many licenses are available and how that gets doled out is up to the regulatory authority that gets formed. And then they write a 5-year plan.
Yeah.
And so like, it's really the sort of, I guess the minister would kind of indicate to the regulatory authority what tone they expected from that plan, which is why I'm seeking to be the Minister of Cannabis.
Yeah, and I think the other thing we've talked about is allowing greater local customization. So allowing certain areas, if they don't want to have retail in their area, that's fine. And if they do want to have more liberal retail in their area, such as cannabis cafes, that should be fine too.
That would be a good way around it, actually. Yeah, because it's, we're trying to please everyone with this bill, which I guess makes sense when we're just voting on the referendum. But when it does come down to brass tacks of how is this actually going to work, localizing it would be good, because that would allow those more restrictive settings to be in place in certain areas and less in others. And of course, as you've mentioned many times, we would have to create some sort of online facility, which is expressly prohibited in the current version of the bill.
Yeah,
but I think that's an oversight.
Yeah, a real shame. So we're getting lots of questions. Let's take some easy ones. This one from Feo. Would you release people currently in prison for weed-related charges?
Oh, I think that's an obvious next step. I mean, that's not anything in the bill, but that's where the discussion goes to after that. I mean, I think this bill is still really, and even the campaigning for the referendum, except for that coming from top, is based on cannabis harm and cannabis shame still, but once we get over that, then we can start talking about people not having to be ashamed about cannabis use. And then once we realize that and accept that as a society, then we'll look back and say, well, what about all those people we forcibly shamed and humiliated for their cannabis use? Don't they deserve a recompense?
And the real big thing that sticks out to me is, particularly coming from the national side of the house, which is always pushes back on any sort of clamping down on alcohol. So alcohol causes 3 times the harm of cannabis, and yet they think that and prohibition so clearly didn't work for alcohol, yet they think it's working for cannabis. That's just hypocritical. It's hypocritical.
I'm really, really disappointed that Judith Collins has essentially signaled that she's whipping the party on this issue, because there was really promising people like Shane Ritty obviously understand the public health arguments. People like Chris Bishop obviously smoke cannabis. And they it's just, they're really stuck in a time warp on this issue, and it would be so easy for them to show that they were sort of so modern, because even labor's really scared of this. I mean,
they're playing a very conservative game.
What
about ACT? You don't hear much out of them on this.
No,
which is surprising, because they're supposed to be libertarian.
Yes, they're but their policies are. But David Seymour is like, he has to get elected by the Epsom electorate. The ACT constituency is not the same as the Epsom electorate.
That's right. Okay, back to say no to dope. Dope is addictive and harmful. It wrecks lives. Well, I think we've already...
All the more reason to get people sort of diverted into health programs and, and not sort of counseled by their local tinny house.
And once again,
I'm a vulnerable person. What should I do? Oh, hang with us. Give us all your money. Let us exploit you.
It's not a great look. But again, we come back to the alcohol point, right? Alcohol is 3 times as harmful, causes three times as much harm in society, and yet we we think the management of that is a-okay.
Well, it's interesting because the alcohol action people, have been pushing for more sensible regulation of alcohol for years. They're not even proposing that alcohol be regulated as strictly as cannabis is regulated in this bill.
No.
Tobacco under Smoke-Free 2020 isn't even regulated as strongly as cannabis in this bill. So it is really quite restrictive. And I think, the alcohol people, they were toying with the idea of explaining that cannabis should be legalized to help people understand that they're not saying alcohol should be banned or prohibited. Unfortunately, they didn't go down that road, but all harmful substances should be controlled in a similar manner, with the regulatory settings stricter or more relaxed based on a scientific ranking of harm, which is available.
Sorry, I'm just laughing. Comment from Tyler: loving the sick mane that dude has. You could father a baby bird in that nest. That's great. Yeah. This one
we did find a new species. My 3-year-old daughter found a new species yesterday, she said.
Question from Warwick. From Ben. What will happen with workplace drug testing?
That's a totally separate issue. And, same with drug driving and the cannabis driving, and that's going to have to be tweaked a little bit. But I think drug driving provides a good sort of template sort of for a path forward, because if you look at drug driving as it stands now compared to workplace drug testing, and let me just preface this by saying in Colorado, workplace drug testing is still firmly in place. Urine testing for cannabis that shows legacy use, not current use, and tons of people are excluded from employment by it. None of that has changed because of cannabis legalization. No. And obviously, like, more progressive companies or Colorado-based companies have kind of been educated out of that practice, but multinationals and big corporates, and it's still the norm, and there's still a huge drug testing industry pushing their product. So
just to explain this for people, Abe, with urine testing or DNA sampling, or even I think saliva is the same, cannabis stays in your system for far longer than you are intoxicated by it, right?
Good question. So there's a hierarchy. There's urine, saliva, and blood, and urine testing is the cheapest and easiest and least invasive, and because they don't have to swab you or prick you and you're just peeing, but it only shows legacy use. Like you don't excrete THC, you excrete the breakdown products of THC, and the way THC is stored in you and broken down over time means you're going to excrete those for weeks or a month. So that shows legacy use, not current use. And that's what we have now for workplace testing. And that's why it's unfair, because anybody who's ever smoked cannabis is apparently unemployable because they present a safety risk.
If you smoke on the weekend and you can still be perfectly functional during the week.
Now compare that to drug driving. In a court of law, there's no way that the New Zealand police would get away with charging someone with something as serious as drug driving if there was any sort of wiggle room in the scientific evidence. If their lawyer could say, this just shows legacy use, this doesn't show they were currently used. So they're not able to use that system. They have to use a more robust system that involves blood, because it's only in blood that you can actually detect the active amount of THC in the blood, which, that micrograms per mil corresponds to a certain amount of highness, if you will.
Okay.
Now that's going to be different for different people, but at least you're getting a level of the active ingredient being current. And that's what is required because you're charging people with a serious offense. And so there's still issues because there's not robust international literature to say this amount of THC in blood correlates to this much impairment.
Yeah.
And it is subjective and different for different people. But that's why for drug driving, the police first have to administer an impairment test. So independently, they determine if you are impaired.
Okay. So
this touching your
this
nose,
is walk on a straight
walking
line
backwards,
right,
looking and looking at your pupils, which, you know, we won't get into that now, but that's a little bit subjective and allows them to pick who passes and fails and things like that. But once you've failed the impairment test, then if you have any THC in your blood at all, under the existing New Zealand legislation, that is deemed to be the cause of the impairment. Okay. And you're then guilty of drug driving. Okay. But so that it's that stringent level of testing that's required for evidence. So you could say in employment cases, really what responsible employers should do, if they don't want to penalize people using cannabis in the weekends, and they do want to genuinely only detect people who are like impaired on the job, would be to test their blood. Now,
but it's simply expense. Is that
it's more expensive. The agency that does it isn't set up to do it. That's not the product they're trying to sell in volume to these employers. But you'd imagine that, you know, if cannabis is legalized, we'd try to advocate for a more fair system. Now, this hasn't happened in Colorado, but we could do better in New Zealand. And saliva is a different thing as well. Like saliva is sort of newer and less reliable and not detecting the actual THC. It's more like the changes that occur in your mouth when you've smoked cannabis or whatever. And but it has more
chocolate. It's trying to detect the high levels of chocolate, is it?
Well, there's certain salivary changes that, you know, it's like where urine is what comes after, the saliva testing is what comes before.
Right. Okay.
But it's not as developed, and so there's more false positives. That usually has to be backed up by a confirmatory test, but it is cheap and less invasive than a prick. So for instance, the mines in Australia will saliva test their employees, and that is really only showing if they've used it very recently.
Okay.
And then if it is positive, they'll use blood to confirm that before they penalize them, because they wouldn't want to penalize anyone from this saliva test, which is somewhat unreliable. Okay. So you could have a two-tier system.
Yeah. Okay, well, that sounds a little bit better. Another one from Andre. Do we know where the tax revenue will be invested? Have there been any commitments, promises, or is that still unknown? I think that is in the proposal from the government, isn't it? To reinvest it in treatment and education.
Yeah, but it's very vague. I mean, there's kind of the spirit of that is there, but again, that kind of will come down to the regulatory authority and the levies that are set and the amount of revenue that comes back. And it's not technically ring fenced in the legalistic way it would need to be strictly ring fenced, if you know what I mean.
Okay, so a little bit vague there from
rhetorical, but you know, the spirit
allows them to
that's the thought that
spend it on what they want. Okay, they call another one from Say Nope to Dope. They call it cannabis control. Do you? Up to 40 joints per person per day. So what they're saying is that people could purchase up to 40 joints per day. Is that really cannabis control?
This is hilarious because there's a backstory to this number. This is Paula Bennett's statistic.
Okay. Yeah.
This is Paula Bennett's statistic from when she held up the baggie in Parliament.
Yeah, the bag of oregano.
And
oregano.
I was always joking with people that you know, it was really cool to come to Wellington during the year of the referendum, because you could be, you know, giving it your best effort like we were in Dunedin for decades and have virtually no impact, you know, on the decision makers. But in Wellington, you could kind of trip over yourself accidentally and, you know, influence national policy or the conversation. This particular number, when the bill came out, you know, when the full final text of the draft was released in April, people were scrambling, or maybe it was a little before that. All the agencies were scrambling, because I can't remember when Paula held up that bag. I think it was pre-COVID, so maybe it was more November when the draft first came out. But everybody wanted to say something right away, but there was a lot to read, right? And so they kind of had the executive summary and were trying to put out talking points. And Paula Bennett was asking, her junior staffers, like, how many joints is this? I need a number of how many joints this represents to, make my statement. And so one of them was like, oh, I've got a mate who's a big cannabis guy. I'll ring him and ask him. And this is a person that I've met in Wellington.
Right.
And then I was speaking to, and he was telling me the story. And so his mate, who works in Paula Bennett's office, rung him up and was like, oh yeah, you see the legislation, how many joints is 28 grams? He thought, maybe 40, 42, he didn't really know, like he just kind of assumed half a gram a joint maybe, or whatever. And obviously a joint is not a metric unit or anything.
Absolutely.
But
some of them are this big and some of them are this big.
But yeah, he just pulled the number out of his ass, and that went back to Paula Bennett, and she presented it in Parliament, and now it's part of Hansard, and it's part of the public record of our great referendum debate.
Oh well, thank you so much. Say no to dope. But it's like, I mean, the crack up with this thing is, it's like when you're going to the when you're going to the supermarket, I mean, we don't want to get into talking about COVID panic buying now, but nor do you want to go to the supermarket and have to buy one roll of toilet paper every time you go.
Exactly.
I mean, you want to buy for the next few weeks, or maybe even the month, and
especially if you live rurally. Yeah. So the idea that just because you can buy a certain amount in a day means that you're going to consume it all that day. Well, essentially that was the limit, and that limit you see across the legislation, that's just a uniform limit for the amount that is kind of allowed to be carried around outside of your house.
Okay.
So if that's the limit you're allowed to carry, or you're allowed to have in your vehicle, or this or that, it should be the amount you're allowed to buy. They're not going to set all these different limits and make it hard to enforce.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay. Good one.
The
one from Ben. How does this align with our smoke-free policy? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Sorry, we just lost that in this.
And I get that question a lot because, they say, oh, smoke-free 2025, why are we legalizing cannabis? That's a say no to dope talking point as well.
Right.
But I don't think people really understand what smoke-free 2025 means. Smoke-free 2025 is not criminally prohibiting tobacco and allowing police to warrantlessly wiretap and search people for growing tobacco or consuming tobacco. In fact, Smoke-free 2025 allows people to grow their own tobacco and smoke it when they want.
Exactly.
Smoke-free 2025 is just about advertising, commercial promotions, sales, use in public places.
Yeah.
None of that is allowed for cannabis under this current bill.
Yeah.
So if smoke-free New Zealand still looks like people being allowed to grow it and smoke it, if they choose to take the risk and their own personal responsibility in their own homes, let's apply the same thing to cannabis. In fact, that's exactly what this bill is. It's a convergence of public health control legislation around intoxicating substances, not alcohol yet.
No.
Because of its powerful lobby, but tobacco lobby had all, the tobacco lobby's already fled New Zealand.
Yeah.
They lost, and they're not going anywhere. But cannabis is being controlled more than tobacco. Tobacco, we know, is a killer. They can still sell it at supermarkets and dairies. Cannabis is not going to be allowed to be sold at supermarkets and dairies.
Yeah. And I mean, we've kind of, you look at the tobacco stuff, we've kind of hit the limit of how far increasing the price actually helps more than it harms, right? Because you're at the level now where people are robbing dairies to get cigarettes.
Oh yeah, it's like a little gold brick, a pack of tailies. Yeah,
where you're putting poor people who are addicted to cigarettes under incredible financial pressure with the price of cigarettes, and so. Actually, I think where people are going now is they're starting to push vaping and alternatives, right? Because if you're this much of an addict, let's at least try and reduce the harm again by pushing vaping. And again, that's where the alternatives for cannabis use, which the Say No to Dope campaign hates so much, are actually a really good thing.
The
Edibles,
vape pens,
vaping,
yeah.
all
Yeah.
that sort of stuff gets rid of most of the harm from weed. And why the hell would we not want to do that? In fact, that's actually something that some of the money from cannabis should be going into subsidizing, right? Getting people cheaper vape pens, getting people access to lower harm ways of ingesting this stuff.
And I think it's important to point out, I guess, another question, maybe it has come up, maybe it hasn't yet, is patient access for medical users. We have a medical cannabis program that's just sort of gone live, a couple of months ago. We haven't gotten a really chance to see how well it works or what it looked like. But the products are going to be very expensive. They'll be available very soon, but they'll be expensive.
Hugely expensive. And that's because they're pharmaceutical grade, right? I mean,
that's right. They're held to a higher standard. They are medicines. And the opportunity for people who are more, on the less serious end of their complications, using cannabis for more of a therapeutic medication to get cheaper access through something like the referendum is a real possibility. But I guess it's also important to note that because of the restrictions in the referendum, especially around potency and type of products, really certain patients who do need a more potent product or a lower harm product like vapes or edibles will initially need to access still through the medical scheme. Yeah. Because those products won't be allowed under this legislation if it remains this strict.
Wow. Okay, well, that's pretty full on. Okay, back to say nope to dope. Legalizing cannabis while promoting health is hypocritical. You can't legalize cannabis and promote mental health because addiction is exactly what big marijuana wants. Well, yeah, I mean, again, this is, really just scaremongering, isn't it? It's the... And if we're going to call anyone hypocrites, like I said, it should really be anyone who thinks alcohol should be legal and cannabis should be illegal.
Quite often we hear the phrase addiction and mental health, like, it's like combined nowadays, and I don't think, for, a lot of people with mental health issues have addictions, but that's not the cause of their mental health issues.
No.
But I think that's the implication with this messaging around cannabis is that cannabis causes people to have mental health issues. And I think, it's been clearly shown that cannabis abuse is adjacent to mental health issues in certain cases, but not necessarily the cause of it.
The opposite of addiction is connection. That's, I don't know, have you seen, this is all like TED Talks, what was the chap's name? He's written a whole bunch of books about addiction and mental health, essentially, and just saying that the best inoculation for mental health issues is connecting with people, having people in your lives. Not the way we treat a lot of that stuff. Actually, the way we treat addiction is actually totally the opposite of the way that helps people with their addiction.
Well, the cannabis community that I've experienced, in my time promoting sort of...
Chasing the Scream, Johan Hari. Yes, that's it. Yeah.
But promoting cannabis enthusiasm and the cannabis community, around that is a beautiful thing. And I think a lot of those people having been ostracized from mainstream society because of prohibition is not going to help their mental health. And certainly, feeling that connection and having a community, I think can actually help mental health with legalization. Yeah.
We got Shane LeBrun on this stream, mate. This kia ora, Shane. Nice to see you on this stream. He's do you know Shane?
Yeah. Shane's a great guy.
Yeah, awesome. Done some
everybody
awesome...
who's anybody is watching this stream right now. It would appear.
He's done some awesome mahi in the medicinal sphere, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so from Kim. So wouldn't it be true that if harm is mostly from regular use and not nearly as many people regularly smoke as drink, that we can expect increased harm from cannabis if it is legalized. Colorado saw considerable increases in the past 30-day use amongst adults post-legalization, for example. Brackets, I'm voting yes. I just think you're being a little reductionist about this. Surely we wouldn't allow the alcohol genie out of the bottle if we had another chance. Seriously? So we could be a lot more careful about this too. Oh, that just jumped.
Well, I think it's not that we wouldn't allow the alcohol genie out of the bottle. We certainly wouldn't have criminal prohibition. We're talking about criminalization, and militarized enforcement of that criminalization. That's what's crazy. We're not talking about some form of regulatory control, just not the most extreme one.
Yeah.
We're just backing off a little. And I think, as we've mentioned, this bill is still very, very restrictive. The only increases in use that have been detected that are statistically significant in jurisdictions post-legalization are in the 50 plus age bracket. So it's really kind of more law abiders that have come away from it in their older age because they have more to lose reputationally or financially. When the stigma is taken off and legality is restored, they go back to it.
And I know lots of people like that, absolutely, and they would go back to it for pain. A lot of them, in their older age, to deal with pain.
And I think cannabis is clearly less harmful than alcohol, and as the questioner said, not nearly as many people regularly smoke as drink. The amount of people that regularly drink in New Zealand is too much. We all agree on that.
Yeah.
A little bit of substitution would massively help our public health. None of that has been factored in, the idea of substitution. People just think the use is going to go up. Cannabis use will go up a bit, I hope, because that's the only way we're going to be able to get alcohol use to go down. We're not going to get all those people to just stop alcohol and do nothing. I mean, if that worked, then these campaigners against alcohol abuse would have succeeded already. You know what I mean?
Another question on here is around why not decriminalize? Why legalize? Why not just decriminalize?
Well, I mean, decriminalize doesn't actually control. It just removes that criminal stigma.
Yeah.
And what I think people who say that fail to recognize is this bill does actually decriminalize cannabis as well. It regulates cannabis in certain scenarios, but if you go outside of those regulations, you're still going to face a penalty, but it's not criminal. You don't have your life ruined. You don't get a record and the stigma and all of that. So it is, it is decriminalizing as well. And I think, if we just decriminalized, it would do nothing about who controls the market.
Yeah.
The black market would still be there.
That's the big thing, eh? I mean, you're still leaving it.
So there's the harms of prohibition and then the harms of the black market and coming into contact with the black market, which I guess we haven't talked about, because it's not only preventing children. And I guess this is the little bit of the trying to have it both ways as well. The higher you set the age and the more you exclude young people from the legal system, people under 20 are still going to have to go to the black market if they want to access it. And that will probably still exist. So in a way, the age probably could be lower. I think also if you have a bunch of people who are between 18 and 20 and they're excluded from the legal cannabis market, all they have left is the legal alcohol market. And that's not the age we want to be giving, telling people this is all you can do, basically, do this as much as you, that'd be harmful.
Yeah, well, I think it's probably natural that it's erring on the side of being conservative initially, and then once people realize that the sky doesn't fall in, we can talk about how to get the settings right.
And I think that'll happen pretty quickly, actually, because I'm already sensing a bit of the more that it seems like a foregone conclusion, the more people were kind of pretending they were uptight about it or not saying anything just in case the tide turned back again. That's falling away. And, if we have a successful yes vote, almost immediate, even in the time that it comes for the parliamentary negotiations to form the government, let alone the time it takes for the select committee process to take place and go through, like the stigma of cannabis is going to rapidly wash away. And if the draft bill says you can grow 2 plants and you can smoke it, and that's what we vote on and passes on election day, even though it's not technically implemented till it's read into parliament and the regulatory authority is formed, and that'll take a couple of years. I can imagine most New Zealanders are going to be planting those plants and torching up on the day. So I don't know if they're going to be, I don't see any point of vigorously enforcing against that in the in-between time.
It's got to be some time for celebration. And I've seen a few people asking you in the stream, Abe, just because I think we're wrapping up now, but I've seen a few people ask, what's your views on, do you have a favorite strain, any particular balance between CBD and THC that you particularly enjoy?
Well, I'm coming to appreciate CBD more. I mean, let me just first say, like, I did my master's in botany, and I'm looking forward to hopefully doing my PhD in specifically cannabis botany in the very near future.
Awesome.
And
do you want to give people a quick lesson on THC versus CBD?
Well, I'm personally more interested in the minor cannabinoids, but the trichome, that is like the crystal, the keef, the hash, that's where all of the active components of the cannabis plant are. So it's not actually in the leaf material. And THC is the one we hear the most about. CBD is the one we hear the second most about, the one that doesn't get you high, but is a medicine, to simplify. But there's 144 cannabinoids, and there's over 200 terpenes. And it's actually the mixtures and combinations of all those. There's 64 million different possibilities. And that's not even including concentration. So that's where all of this gap between anecdote and evidence lies, because we haven't measured the right chemicals to, the effects that are happening. People aren't lying about them and making them up. We just haven't developed the right tools to measure them or elucidated the chemical structures of all these molecules or of all our receptor systems. So that's understandable. But I'm appreciating CBD a lot more. A lot of recreational users, they just want the highest THC. And that was me for a long time, and is me again right now. But actually over lockdown, I took a tolerance break, which is something I like to do regularly. I'm not going to say how regular it is, but in the past 25 years, I've done it multiple times. And this time was one of the longer ones that I've experienced, just because now that I live in Wellington and having just moved here and then the lockdown, I didn't actually know very many people. And, I didn't know people and you couldn't go out. So it wasn't really easy to find weed. And, I just thought I should ration, and I thought it was a good time to take a tolerance break. And whenever you take a tolerance break, it actually, even just a day or, even just half a day, you get a stronger effect if you're a regular user. And so I like to do that because I don't want to just be desensitized to it all the time. But then coming back to it, you realize how strong it can be for some people. So actually, for me, consuming as much THC as possible fairly regularly, and then not doing that for a while, it was kind of like, oh, I see why some people don't like this, because if you're naive to it, it can be very confronting. But that made me realize that CBD isn't just a sort of weak weed that I don't want. It could actually be, it could be good for the right person for the right reasons.
Absolutely. And I think a lot of what I notice actually, and again, this I realize what you say, that New Zealand is quite unique in this respect, but the strains of weed that were around in New Zealand when I was a teenager are quite different to what's around now. And when I talk to people, people who are a bit younger than me, they tend to have that their reaction to cannabis is like, oh no, that stuff is just messes me up. And often I think, well, and when if they ever try, the different strains that were more common when I was a teenager, a lot of them tend to like that sort of stuff. And so I think that is
exactly. Well, that's when I had my tolerance break. I was smoking the strong weed that I had before my period of abstinence, which was like over a month this time. So I was like a kid again, basically. And I would smoke some of the strong stuff, and I was like actually like too high. And that was something that I hadn't experienced in a while. And it was kind of made me realize that, for some people who want to experience that sort of euphoria and pleasure and the positive effects, but don't, that some people experience negative side effects from too much THC. And, it's easy to get over that pretty quickly, but that's no reason to sort of discount that as part of the experience.
Yeah.
And like you say, those more balanced strains or the weaker strains, like you can still have the pleasure of getting high and smoking a joint and experiencing the terpene profiles and the terroir without getting totally slammed. But if you like that, then you should be allowed to do that too.
yeah, totally. Okay, hey, so we better wrap it up now. Lastly, I've got to say, have a think if there's anything else that you haven't said, Abe, that you wanna just finish as a final comment. I'm just going to say, on my part, if you want these awesome t-shirts, you can get them at shop.top.org.nz. Just another wasted vote. Grab one. They're very subtle top branding on the side.
Well, one thing that I'd like to say is I think it's really important that we're here shifting the goalposts and what's acceptable for debate. And that's why I defected to top from ALCP in 2017. And people might, this is a joke on the shirt, but even if we don't get 5%, last time we didn't get 5%, but we had a significant influence on the tone of the debate of the election and what was considered, fair game and what wasn't. And if you look at certain parties' policies now, this election, they're very similar to the ones that we got a lot of traction on last election, because they realized, we need to sort of capture this enthusiasm or we're going to lose it. And that cannabis is included in that, as well as things like UBI and changes in tax structure. So it's so important for us to be here, because if we weren't there as a threat of them losing that vote, they wouldn't be pushed into a more progressive position. Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, still got questions coming through. Hey, thank you so much for engaging in this. We've had so many questions. Maybe we should do another one, Abe. And since we've got a bit more time to the election.
Yeah, well, I used to do a weekly cannabis radio show for 10 years. So this is feeling really good to be back in the saddle. And but part of our gimmick is we would consume live on air for the fans to see. So if we're going to do it again, I might insist, at least for me. I don't know.
All right. Well, stay tuned, and perhaps next time. Kia ora, Abe. Good to see you again, brother.
Always. Wouldn't it be awkward if I